Alright, hey guys, welcome to my very first YouTube video. In this video, we're going to be going over the UFC Fight Night Stephen Thompson vs. Kevin Holland card, or simply known as UFC on ESPN 42. On paper, this looks like it's going to be a pretty good event. It's 15 fights long, it's a crowded event, which will definitely up the wildcard factor for the whole card. I don't have picks for every single fight on this card, so this is not a full card breakdown, but rather what I feel the most confident about, because let's be honest, my luck is just not that good. Anyway, the last event was just okay. Even though it was a little boring, I thought it was pretty good for bets, because in my opinion, I think the boring cards usually are. The fights were a bit closer in the last card than in this one, as shown with the odds. Like, most of the odds in this card lean toward one side pretty heavily, but I did pick some dogs for you guys. So, anyway, here are my picks. Alright, so first pick of the night is for Marcelo Rojo versus Francis Marshall, and I have Marcelo Rojo winning this one against Francis Marshall. At the time of recording this, Rojo's an underdog, and honestly I have no idea why. I think it's an absolute steal. Rojo's impressed me a lot in the past. He's had only 2 fights so far in the UFC, and both of them have been really pretty good. He fights like a dog, and he's always going for the finish. He went up against opponents who really shouldn't be put up against newcomers, in Charles Jourdain and Kyler Phillips, and honestly he did pretty well against them. He almost finished both of them. His UFC debut was against Charles Jourdain. This was a fight that he took on short notice and almost ended up winning. He's backed by a pretty good gym in Entrum Gym, where he trains with Brandon Moreno, someone who's usually cornering him for all of his fights. Anyway, the one thing I've noticed about Rojo is that his fights usually end in the 3rd round. He is always going for the finish, and I think that requires a bit of gas to keep up for the entirety of 3 rounds. What usually ends up happening is that he fights really well for the first 2 rounds, and around the 3rd round he gets a little gassy, which causes him to slow down, and that's when his opponents get the finish on him. But still, I don't see this happening with Francis Marshall. Francis Marshall looks to me like yet another ESPN era signing. That's only there to round out the numbers. Francis Marshall is someone who I don't think is not yet ready for the UFC, taking the stage against someone who has miles more experience than him. His record is good for the kind of fighter that he is. You know, he's a newcomer who's fought mostly other newcomers with either less than 10 fights or guys that are on 10-fight losing streaks, before getting the Contender Series call and getting the contract. I don't really like what the UFC is doing to the regional scene right now. These fighters aren't getting the chance to hone their skills or get better at the sports with opponents who are on an appropriate level as them, because they're getting fast-tracked by Dana White's Contender Series into the UFC, where they fight far more skilled opponents who they have no business being in there with, at least not at this time of their career. It's like a pro NBA team versus high school regional champions. These guys and gals are going like 0-3 or 1-3 at best in their UFC tenure before eventually getting cut. Thanks, Dana. Alright, so the next fight listed is Jonathan Pearce versus Darren Elkins, and my pick is Jonathan Pearce, or JSP, to win against Darren Elkins. I feel like this is one of the easier picks that I don't really feel like I have to go into that much for, given how high of a favorite JSP is right now. So right now he's sitting at minus 450, and with good reason too, I think. JSP is a very fast-paced fighter who has a keen eye for finishes. He takes the first round to feel out his opponents, but doesn't take it slow on them either. His fighting style is to get the fight over with as soon as possible. He will usually get the finish in round 2 or 3 after feeling out his opponents, but he's not really opposed to getting them out of there in round 1 either. On Darren Elkins, I really can't believe that he's still fighting. I think Elkins is someone that's been out of his prime for a very long time, and he's been the older name for a new fighter to make a name off of for just as long. He's a lot slower than he was before, and it takes him a good second or two to respond to stuff in a sport where the seconds are really crucial. I think at this point in his career, he's a test for newcomers to the UFC, for the brass to decide whether or not the newcomer is cut out for the organization. I think JSP is only one fight away from getting a ranked opponent. I wouldn't be surprised if he got his ranked opponent after this fight. I think JSP will be able to finish the fight given the slower, more zombie-like version of the current Darren Elkins. So the next one up is Marc DIakese versus Michael Johnson, and despite what the odds say, I would say that this is actually a pretty evenly matched fight. I would give the slight edge to Johnson standing up, and I'd give the slight edge to DIakese on the ground. Johnson by KO is always a live bet in any Johnson fight, but his chin is also pretty much deleted, so there's that. If I absolutely had to pick someone in this fight, I'd have to go with DIakese, probably by decision, and I think that his way to victory will be through the ground. I think that the overs in this fight and the fight going the distance would be a good bet, whereas picking who wins the fight is the riskier bet. Johnson's last two fights were very good, a finish over Alan Patrick and a very close decision with Jamie Mullarkey that I think Johnson won. I think that fight worked out so well because it was spent mostly standing up. DIakese's last two fights were won because of what he did on the ground. DIakese can do stand-up, but I don't think it's something that he focuses on that much anymore, as opposed to his grappling. His last two fights were pretty much lay and pray wins. He gets good takedowns and just holds his opponents on the ground. On the flip side though, Johnson is pretty good standing up, but not that good on the ground. Lately I've seen that Johnson doesn't really try that hard when it comes to the ground, like in his fight with Thiago Moises. In the second round when Moises got the takedown, he didn't really try that hard and more or less just let Moises get the finish. I think that there will be quite a few takedowns in this fight, as well as at least one random knockdown somewhere. I think if your bookie allows it, a same game parlay with those would make a pretty good bet. Okay, so the next one up is Clay Guida versus Scott Holtzman, and this is one I'm actually very excited about. I think this is going to be a very fun fight between two older guys. Anyway, at the time of recording this, much like Marcelo Rojo, Clay Guida is an underdog right now, and I think it's an absolute steal. So, let's look at Holtzman first. He's been in the UFC for quite a while now, serving as a mid-card guy for the better part of his career. His wins are over guys who have mostly since been cut from the UFC. He's had a few finishes in the UFC, but nothing really notable. His last two fights were losses to Beneil Dariush and Matheus Gamrot, both of whom expose a skill gap between the fighters in each bout. Holtzman's not that bad of a fighter though, he's good at the mid-range level where he's at right now. But his shortcomings do start to show when he's faced with an opponent who has a bit more experience than he has. Clay Guida's getting up there in age. He's 40 years old now to Holtzman's 39, but Guida still got it. Guida seems more comfortable with himself now. He still fights recklessly like he did when he was younger, sometimes to his detriment, but it's not something you'd expect to see from a seasoned fighter such as himself. You'd expect someone in his age range to be short on gas, but he can fight a fast-paced 3 rounds competently, as seen in the Marc Madsen and Michael Johnson fights, as well as in many grappling tournaments, which I think he just does for fun now. I believe Guida won his fight against Marc Madsen, but ended up losing the decision. Many such cases in the UFC, an event really wouldn't feel right if there wasn't at least one botched decision. But anyway, Madsen, who recently lost to Grant Dawson, is an Olympic-level wrestler, and Guida out-wrestled and out-grappled Madsen over 3 rounds at a good pace. He had a good fight with Michael Johnson, where he scored many good takedowns. I think Guida's path to victory here will be through the ground, while Holtzman will have the heavy-handed power advantage, but Guida's chin is still intact. Anyway, I think this fight will probably go the distance. I see at least one knockdown and at least one takedown happening. The next one up is Jack Hermansson versus Roman Dolidze, and I have Jack Hermansson winning this one. Jack Hermansson is a favorite in this fight. At the time of recording, he's minus 165, but I do think he should be a lot higher of a favorite than he is right now. The odds have it as a close fight, but I don't think that will be the case at all. Dolidze has had a good 3 last fights, but I think he's gotten lucky so far. I don't think a win over either DIakese bro is anything to brag about, and honestly, I think Phil Hawes would have easily gotten a victory in that fight if he didn't injure his leg mid-fight. Anyway, Dolidze has a very lay and pray style of fighting. Like, he gets a lot of his victories by hugging his opponent, and sloppily so. I think Hermansson is easily the better grappler and better wrestler than Dolidze, as he usually tries to get his opponents to the ground in each fight. I think the fight will start off very fast-paced, at least on Dolidze's end. The first round will probably be when Dolidze is most dangerous. I think he will try to strike and shoot on Hermansson a lot in the first round, only to fight a calmer fight in the later 2 rounds. Hermansson is skilled on the feet as well, as he was able to shut down Chris Curtis pretty well in his last fight. I think this fight will go the distance, and with Hermansson getting the decision win. However, it is possible that Dolidze can make a mistake and get caught early into the fight. A mistake that Hermansson would capitalize on pretty quick, as he does have a pretty good fight IQ and doesn't waste any chance for finishes, as seen with Kelvin Gastelum. And for the last one, we've got Schnell versus Matheus Nicolau. And I feel like this is yet another obvious pick, as he's a high favorite, but I've got Matheus Nicolau winning here. I feel like Nicolau is probably the most underrated fighter in the flyweight division who isn't getting the attention and recognition he should right now. A dark horse, if you will. While not the most exciting fighter, he certainly has the skill and the fight IQ to get out of bad situations and knows how to hold on to a fight in order to win. He's been in a lot of kill or die situations, like in the Tim Elliott fight and some parts of the Manel Cup fight, but had enough skill to get out of it instead of being stuck in there. I think in the UFC, Nicolau has faced and beat higher level competition than Schnell has. I would say that this is probably Schnell's biggest step up in competition. Schnell is ranked number 11 in his division, but this feels a lot like a fight between someone ranked versus an undercard fighter. The sad truth is that the flyweight division is just as dead as the heavyweight division, where a single random win will instantly put you in the rankings. Schnell had a good fight in his last outing against Su Mudaerji, but it was a very iffy win. Pretty much Schnell won in kill or die mode. He got more or less knocked out like 3 times in the fight before catching a lucky sub to close out the fight. Other than that, he has losses to Royval in round 1, a loss to Rogerio Bontorin, and a split decision win over Tyson Nam. I think someone like Brandon Royval is more fit to fight Nicolau. I feel like that will be a good, appropriately matched fight. Anyway, I think this fight will probably go the distance, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a round 2 or 3 finish by Nicolau. Alright, so those were my picks for the Stephen Thompson versus Kevin Holland event. 6 picks, just the ones that I feel very confident about. There were a few other fights that I wanted to talk about but didn't feel too confident about, like Natan Levy versus Gennaro Valdez. I think Valdez will probably win, but I don't really have the reasoning to back up why. But, you know, pretty good bump fight, I suppose. And there's also Rafael Dos Anjos versus Brian Barberena. I think RDA gets the easy win there because Barberena doesn't really have a good time with guys who like switch it up. And also, I don't think a win over the corpse of Robbie Lawler is, you know, much to brag about. Either way, if you guys, if all 10 of you watching this liked the content, please consider liking, subscribing, and, you know, say something in the comments. Thanks. Have a good one.